When you have an MP3 file ready to go for your first episode, upload that to your podcast folder with FileZilla or whatever FTP program you've been using for your website. In the first half of the kit, we talked about how important it is to make sure that your folders and file names are short, catchy, and don't use any spaces, numbers, or special characters other than maybe a hyphen. You can name your MP3 file Episode 1 or Summer 2018 Mix if you really want to, but it's better to try and think about it more strategically. Using very descriptive words here will give you much more effective links and make it easier for people to remember and share them. That approach will also help you rank on search engines and podcast directories by reinforcing your brand with carefully chosen keywords. Depending on your domain name, the ideal strategy for setting up folders and naming files would be to have your links structured something like this: yourname.com, a folder for your MP3s named after the title of your podcast, and then a descriptive episode title for that specific file. If you named your domain after your podcast, it might be more like the title of your podcast.com, then the actual word podcast or something equally important like music that's not already in your domain name, followed by an episode title with some strong focused keywords. The URL shouldn't be too long or complicated and needs to make it very obvious what the file is all about. Include important search terms that play off of each other to build on a description of the link in a very clear way that reads almost like a sentence. When your 1400 by 1400 pixel JPEG or PNG podcast artwork is ready, you can upload that to your site too. I decided to put mine in the home public HTML directory because that's where the RSS file goes, but it's fine if yours is in the same podcast folder as your MP3 episodes or wherever you uploaded your other website images through FTP. You're now ready to set up an RSS feed and launch your podcast channel. So download the Your Podcast text file under this video to save that on your computer and then open it up. We're going to use this sample RSS feed as the starting point and just replace all of the capitalized text with your information. This is the part that intimidates a lot of people from getting into podcasting because it looks like a complicated computer language at first glance. It's really just an advanced kind of universal embed code, sort of like the ones you might already use to share Google Maps or a YouTube video. An RSS feed is just a series of paired open and closed tags in triangle brackets that define settings and contain information. The second time one of these tags appears, you'll see a slash before the command, which acts like the period in a sentence. These first 3 lines at the top will never change. They make the official announcement that this is an RSS feed and they open up your channel. Eventually they get resolved and the circuit is closed all the way down at the bottom to wrap around everything else on this page, so these will always be the last 2 lines in your feed. The cluster of text here on the top is what will determine your general podcast channel settings, and the bottom paragraph surrounded by item tags is going to be your first episode. This line in the middle will always show the last time your RSS file was updated with a new item. When somebody subscribes to your channel, their computer or device will be monitoring that date, waiting for a more recent one than the last time it checked, so that it can notify them when there's a fresh episode. This will also update your listing in all of the podcast directories at the same time, because they'll be checking that date too, just like a subscriber. iTunes uses slightly different versions of the tags, so there are actually 2 sets of very similar ones built into this feed to make sure that it will work everywhere. At the top of the channel settings paragraph, type in the title of your podcast, your artist name, and your website instead of the letters in caps. Replace the words between the description bookends with a few carefully crafted sentences that use all of your important keywords to perfectly describe your podcast channel and sum up the musical manifesto of your show. You can use up to 4,000 characters for that, but the iTunes subtitle here needs to be a really short sentence or mission statement. It doesn't have a lot of space or visibility in the player, but it can help to reinforce some of your keywords and influence search results in the store. A word that appears in all 3 of your title, subtitle, and description areas will score really high. The iTunes summary should be exactly the same one that you used for your full description above, so you might as well just copy and paste it here. Edit the current year and add your name or website in the copyright tag. If you're going to be doing a lot of swearing or playing music that does, you should probably change the iTunes explicit tag to yes. Leave it on no if that's generally not your style, because you can always turn it on just for specific episodes from the item elements if things ever get too explicit on your future shows. The iTunes owner and email fields should be your artist name and public info@yourwebsite.com address so that people can get in touch with you if they have questions or feedback. In the 2 lines underneath this, you can see where the address of your podcast artwork should go, and that will be either a JPEG or PNG and depend on where you uploaded the image. Enter the title of your podcast and website again here, but leave the 2 category tags set on music. Pick up to 10 or 12 of the most important search terms and keywords that describe your podcast channel and type them in here separated by commas. The pub date entered below that will be the date and time you published your first episode and launched this podcast. Replace that with the first 3 letters of the current day of the week, then add the date, year, and exact time with the hours, minutes, and seconds in 24-hour clock format, which is military style, where 6 p.m. would be 1800 hours. This plus or minus number reflects your time zone correction from GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. The Atom link address will be the location where you upload and host this RSS file. We're going to put that into the home public HTML directory, and the file name should be pretty close to your podcast title, with a .xml extension added. If your domain name already has the title of your podcast in it, maybe you'll just call the file podcast.xml. When we finish up here, you'll save this text file and then change the name and .txt extension so that it matches that Atom link exactly. As soon as you upload this, it will then become your RSS feed. That's it for the channel settings, so let's look at the bottom paragraph between the item tags and turn it into your first podcast episode by making a few more changes. This section will contain just the specific information about your first podcast episode, so put in a descriptive title here that's different than the name of your podcast. Type in your own name again on the next line, and then add your website right under that. Inside the square description brackets, you can type out a full description of the first episode, paste in your track listing, or add any other text that will tell people exactly what they're going to hear in that MP3 file. This should be much more specific than the general description you wrote in the channel settings above, and will focus just on the contents of this episode. The iTunes subtitle can be similar to the episode title that you already typed in on the first line, but if you can do it in just 2 to 4 words, try a really quick tease that describes the episode a little bit more at a glance and reinforces some important search terms. It'll show up here in your podcast listing, so as you can see, there's not a lot of space. You can paste the same description you already used into the iTunes summary area, and that will pop up in a window when somebody clicks the circled I in the store. Add your public email address and artist name beside author, and then change the pub date to the present time and date. For this first episode only, it's going to be the same one that you entered as the pub date in your channel settings that shows when the podcast was launched. Category should stay on music, but the next line that says enclosure URL will need to point to the location where you uploaded the MP3 file. You also need to add the size of the file in bytes to the length area. Find that out on a PC by right-clicking on your MP3 to see its general properties and details, and then copying the number of bytes you see beside size. On a Mac, you can find the size by selecting Get Info from the File menu when you right-click over top of it. Paste that into your text file and replace the letters and caps holding the place. You should also delete any commas that might be in that number so it looks more like this. The GUID on the next line is sort of like a catalog number or matrix code for each of your episodes. You need this to be different for every new item, so podcast titles or just initials with an episode number that you can keep on adding to work really well here. The next line will let you turn on the iTunes explicit warning for just this episode if you need to, and you should enter the duration of your MP3 file in hours, minutes, and seconds under that. You can also find that out in the file properties and with Get Info when you right-click over it. The keywords under that should describe just this episode for iTunes searches, separated by commas. Last thing to do is fill in your website at the bottom between the comments tags. Right now, the pub date in your first item should match the pub date in your channel settings because this is your first episode. Make sure the last build date on the center line also matches those two. Now save this text file, close it, and then change the name to match the one that you entered next to Atom link in your channel settings, making sure to also edit the extension from a .txt to a .xml. Next, open up your FTP program and connect to your site. When you upload that file to your home public HTML directory, it will then become your podcast feed that can be accessed at a URL that looks something like this. Now that your XML file has been uploaded, we need to double check that it will work properly. The first place to go after making any changes to your RSS feed is an online feed validator. This is a website like feedvalidator.org that will try to read your XML file and then let you know if there are any problems with it that you need to fix. Type in the location of your feed, including the http://n.xml extension, click Validate, and give it a few seconds to scan. If something wasn't set up properly, it will let you know that at the top and also highlight the exact line in yellow where the problem is. If I forgot to remove the commas from the length of my first episode like this, for example, I would have to go back and edit the RSS file, then try validating again. From now on, it's much easier to make changes to the feed by logging into cPanel and getting at it through the File Manager section instead of using FileZilla. Open Public HTML and scroll down to find your podcast.xml file. Right-click over top of it and pick Edit, then Edit again from the next screen. This should open up a text view of your file that looks just like it did in your notepad. We can edit and change the info in the same way we did there, so I'll remove the commas from the length of my MP3 file in the first item. After I hit Save Changes in the top right, I can go back to feedvalidator.org and try again. When I click Validate, it should say, "Congratulations, this is a valid RSS feed if we got everything fixed." It'll let you know if your descriptions are too long, if you used more keywords than allowed, or if the time and date aren't formatted properly. They might also tell you that iTunes doesn't like ampersands, so always use a plus sign or type out &AMP semicolon instead for titles, subtitles, or in the summary. Go back and forth between the Feed Validator and cPanel to keep editing the file until you stop getting warnings. The final test is to try and subscribe to your RSS feed using iTunes, Kodi, or whatever you've been using to listen to podcasts so far that will allow manual subscriptions. In iTunes, open up the player, go to the File menu, and then pick Subscribe to Podcast. In the URL box that pops up, type the location of your .xml file, including the http:// then OK. You should now be able to see it along with the others that you're subscribed to in the podcast library. If you don't use iTunes and tried one of the players like Kodi instead, you can add an RSS feed just like any other media source. Type in your feed address, but use RSS:// instead of HTTP. You can even type your RSS feed right into a web browser to see how each one handles it differently. It's always a good idea to double check that your MP3 file is actually there by trying to download or stream it. But unless there's a typo in the enclosure URL, you're probably all set up at this point and now have a working podcast feed on your website.